Becker, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
So, back in January, Congressional Republicans introduced a new bill called the SAVE Act, and it's also known as the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, right? And that bill establishes new citizenship verification requirements for anyone who wants to register to vote. What problem would this bill solve, according to those Congressional Republicans who introduced it?
That's absolutely right. The bill would require that Americans produce something like a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. And purportedly, the bill is being sold as an election integrity measure that would strengthen protections against voting by non citizens. But the truth is that that isn't a problem in this country at all. We know from study after study that only citizens vote, and there are astonishingly few exceptions to that. And that's because it's already against the law under federal and state law for non citizens to register or to vote in state or federal elections. The penalties are quite severe, having immigration consequences for people. So if you think about it, why would a person who is not eligible as a non-citizen register and vote simply to cast one ballot if it could mean they were in prison for several years and deported? It really just doesn't happen. So notwithstanding the complete absence of this problem, we've seen the reintroduction of the SAVE Act in this new Congress, and we've seen that it's being fast tracked. So this is a priority for congressional Republicans this year.
Right. I mean, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud, right? I think there was a report that came out from the Brennan Center that said you were looking at a 4-year span, and over that 4-year span, I think out of something like 250 million votes that were cast, there were only like 100 or 150 instances of voter fraud, right? I mean, so it's negligible. I think that comes out to something like 0.0000 something percent, right? It's negligible.
Yeah, the risk is like infinitesimally small. It's like not countable given the many, many millions of eligible voters who cast ballots in elections. So, what this really would do is make it harder for millions of eligible Americans to register or re register to vote. And that's because many, many people, in fact, by our estimation, over 21 million Americans don't have ready access to something like a passport or a birth certificate that they would need to register or re register to vote if this bill were to become law. So it would stop, it would block tens of millions of Americans from participating in our elections.
So, what forms of ID would this bill require Americans to have to register to vote that most of us don't already have?
For most people, it would require a passport or a birth certificate. There are a number of other different kinds of identifications that are even less accessible and are possessed by even fewer numbers of Americans that are part of the list. But for the vast majority of people, it would be a passport, a birth certificate, or naturalization papers. But what we know is that about 1 in 2 Americans have passports to begin with. So roughly half of people just don't have one of the key documents that could be used in order to register to vote. And we also know that producing birth certificates probably isn't going to be enough for the tens of millions of women who change their name in marriage, for example. So for so many people, the documents that would be needed to register under this bill are totally out of reach.
Right. I was reading criticism of the opposition to this bill, and it was in an article, and they said, well, most Americans can get their hands on a birth certificate. And I was like, no, they can't. Actually, if you're an older American, some older Americans they don't know where their birth certificate is, or they weren't issued a birth certificate. Right. And like you said, for women, myself, I kept my maiden name I never changed my name when I got married, specifically for this reason. And I got married back in 2011. I was worried about the fact that my vote might not count or it might not match up with my ballot. I live in a state where they have vote by mail. So my ballot arrives in my mail every election cycle, and it has my maiden name on it. And, I just thought, I just had an instinct that something like this might happen. But would this also disenfranchise, not only women, but also people who may have had, gender affirming care, the trans community? Would this also affect them too?
Absolutely. Anybody who changed their name could be disenfranchised by this bill, or at a minimum would be heavily burdened by satisfying the requirements of this bill. And I should say that exactly what those requirements are going to be aren't even articulated by the bill, because it puts off onto the states to establish certain processes, which the federal policy wouldn't do. So states will likely have varying paths to registration if you've changed your name, and some of those paths are likely going to be harder to satisfy than others.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is that not only is it disenfranchising people who want to register for the first time, it's disenfranchising millions of people potentially who are already registered, like myself. Like I'm already registered. So how do you anticipate this affecting people who are maybe already registered to vote and they think that they're fine?
Well, the bill would require all applications to register to be accompanied by a presentation of something like a passport or a birth certificate. And it would require that in person with an election official. So it doesn't even contemplate that you can do this online or by mail or at a voter registration drive. And those three methods of registration, online, by mail, and voter registration drives, are extremely popular. So the bill would entirely decimate our system of voter registration, and in some cases altogether eliminate methods of registration because it's requiring that in-person presentation of those documents. So because the bill requires presentation of those documents for all applications to register, for the millions of people who move every year, that would mean that they would have to re-register and then find one of these hard to obtain documents and show up at an election office that may be tens of miles, hundreds of miles, even depending on the county away, and present that in order to register to vote. So even if you are registered, even if you have one of these documents, this bill would put an extraordinary burden to get on and stay on the voter rolls.
Right. And I'm not sure how that would work given the fact that there's this massive purge happening among, federal workers. I'm imagining at some point, election workers in these offices that would handle this type of work would be purged as well. Right. And just even if we kept those numbers the same as they are right now, there would be an incredible amount of people to work through the process. Right. I mean, that just seems kind of untenable to me.
Absolutely. It would be an astonishing amount of people. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission estimates that more than 91 million citizens either registered for the first time or updated their registration in the 2 years leading up to the 2020 election. And in the 2 years leading up to the midterms in 2022, that number was 70 million. To put that in perspective, at the time of those two elections, there were a little over 220 million registered voters. So a huge proportion of the electorate registers or re-registers in advance of elections and would face these barriers and these hurdles to registration. And the bill doesn't contemplate in any meaningful way the realities of election administration, what it would cost to force all of those millions of people to go to an election office and present the kind of documents that many people don't even have. So the bill is really sort of untethered from reality. But unfortunately, the reality is that it very well may come before the House as soon as next week, and is seriously under consideration by our Congress. So we have to confront all of the harms that it would inflict, even as poorly written as it is.
I know we've said millions of people, but can we quantify more precisely how many people would be affected by this? Do we have a number?
Well, different people I should say, populations are going to be affected slightly differently. I mean, we know that more than 21 million Americans don't have ready access to these documents, and so they will be blocked from registering and voting. We know, as I just rattled off the numbers, tens of millions of Americans are registering before presidential elections, and tens of millions are registering or re-registering before general elections. So I don't have in the aggregate all of those numbers, but it is tens and tens of millions of American citizens who are eligible to vote, who wouldn't be able to get registered for the first time or wouldn't be able to register. And we also know that this policy is going to have a harmful effect because we've seen states try to implement a policy like the SAVE Act in their own states. So, for example, when Kansas implemented a similar policy a while back, the courts found that it disenfranchised or stopped from registering over 30,000 voters. Arizona has a proof of citizenship policy in place, and it has also been found to block tens of thousands of voters. And we know that the policy impacts different communities. So it particularly burdens, for example, voters of color and younger voters. So this is a quite a harmful policy, and it especially burdens communities that already often have a hard time accessing and vindicating their right to vote.
Right. I mean, I think it's something that most of us take for granted. If you got your driver's license after when you were 16, you've had it all of your life and you just kind of renew it when it comes up. But there are millions and millions of Americans who have no form of ID or who have forms of ID that aren't even accepted now if they have strict voter ID laws in their state. And I've spoken to people at organizations that help people get their ID, and it is not easy. It's not easy to replace your driver's license for some of these people. It's not easy to find your birth certificate. It's not easy to get a passport, and it's expensive. It's costly, it's time consuming. And imagine having to first spend the time and the money to get those documents and then go in person to take that document to someone and hope that the office that you go to is staffed to be able to process your registration. I mean, that's just not going to happen, especially it's not going to happen for millions and millions of Americans.
Absolutely. And then imagine if you have a sort of added difficulty that might make that even harder. Imagine you're an elderly voter. Imagine you are a voter with a disability. Imagine that you are a working parent who doesn't have alternative childcare for the many hours that you would need to go to an election office and present this documentation. For so many people, the additional burden of having to satisfy these requirements under the SAVE Act would be so high that they frankly wouldn't be able to surpass it.
Right. And I want to frame it in this context because I've been reading lately about this idea of voter friction, right? Voter friction. And this friction is any obstacle that's between the voter and getting their ballot cast, right? And that already exists for people who are registered. Right. So if you are registered to vote and you don't have transportation, you don't have childcare, you can't leave your job to work because you work a 9 to 5 and you're maybe you just don't have anyone to take your shift, it's hard for you to vote. So imagine doubling that for those populations, right? For those demographics. If you have to do this twice in an election cycle, you have to go to register and you have to spend an entire day trying to get to, register. And then you have to do the same thing again in a few months to go vote. I mean, that's going to drastically reduce turnout among very specific demographics that this bill would target.
Absolutely. The research shows in lots of different areas of voting policy that when you lower the cost, whether that's time or money, that it takes for someone to be able to access their right to vote, they are more likely to turn out. And by the same token, when you raise the cost, when you make it harder for them, again, in time or money or other barriers, they are less likely to turn out. And so this bill, the SAVE Act, would raise the cost for all Americans across the board to participate in our democracy. Frankly, it is in our memory and looking, backward on hundreds of years of history, it would be the only federal voter suppression law in modern history and going all the way back to Reconstruction. So it would be an astonishing rollback of voting access at the federal level. And I can't really underscore enough how staggering the impact would be for everyone.
Right. And I think people should really think about how massive this is. If you recall the Shelby County versus Holder case back in 2013, that was probably the biggest assault, I think, on voting rights since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. This would be more impactful than that because Shelby County versus Holder, I think, voter suppression was happening state by state, right? Those states that didn't have the pre-clearance requirement, right? But imagine that happening on a national scale. Right. And just kind of just think about that. I mean, it's hard for me to quantify here and, articulate it, but it would be the hugest assault or the largest assault on voting rights since that.
Questionably, as you said, the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County unleashed state voter suppression laws in a new way because the states that previously had to get approval from the Justice Department or a federal court didn't need to go through that process. But again, and to be sure, we did see state voter suppression unleashed after Shelby County, and we've seen it really acutely since after the 2020 elections. But this would be a blanket law, if enacted, that would apply across the country and would have enormous cost and effect for all Americans. I should also note, speaking of cost, that it's an entirely unfunded mandate. The bill places enormous burdens on states and state and local election officials without giving them any money whatsoever to accomplish these entirely new administrative tasks. And it would fall on the states and then the taxpayers essentially to fund this new mandate, and would be really costly and harmful to election officials and election administration. So beyond the harm to the many tens of millions of American voters, if that weren't enough, it also makes election administration much harder, pushes that burden onto states. And if that weren't enough, it creates criminal and civil liabilities for election officials if they get things wrong. So it really is, a layer upon layer of bad policy for everyone involved in the voting process.
So tell me more about the criminal liability. That's something that I haven't read a lot about. So what would happen? Just give me an example.
So the bill would impose criminal or civil liability on election officials, and criminal liability with a potential for 5 years incarceration. So very serious time if an election official registered somebody who didn't present documentary proof of citizenship, didn't present something like a passport or a birth certificate. And that holds that penalty, that penalty would be possible even if the election official made an honest mistake. So even if they weren't trying to break the law or trying to do something improper. And the election official could also be liable even if the person who purportedly failed to present the passport or the birth certificate, even if that person was an American citizen and was actually eligible to vote. And so it really puts at legal risk election officials who work so hard to make our voting systems work. And it means that any ambiguity in the bill, if it were to become law, is going to be interpreted by election officials essentially against the voter, because election officials don't want to put themselves at risk for a lawsuit or for 5 years incarceration, and reasonably so. Those are really substantial penalties. And so all of the close calls are going to go against the voter.
Yeah, so that incentivizes these workers to lean more in favor of not accepting documentation if they have any doubts, right? So it incentivizes like not registering as many people as possible, honestly.
Absolutely. Every aspect of the bill essentially points in one direction, which is that the bill is trying to make it harder for Americans to access their right to vote.
I think I can safely say this is a nightmare.
Absolutely. It's a nightmare for American voters. It's a nightmare for democracy overall. It's a nightmare for election administration and election officials. It is just a nightmare top to bottom. And we have already heard from many, many Americans across the country who are quite concerned about this bill because of the impact that it would have.
So let me ask you a devil's advocate question, because it's something I get all the time when I post about this on social media. Someone will inevitably get in my comments and say, well, we need to stop these people from, voting when they're not supposed to. Why don't we need ID to register to vote? I mean, we do, but why don't we? Just to play devil's advocate.
So just to be clear, SAVE Act is not a voter ID bill. It's even more stringent than perhaps the kind of voter ID policies that many folks might have already in their states. It's a bill that would require the kind of documentation that tens of millions of Americans don't have, like a passport or a birth certificate, to register to vote. And it would impose that burden and stop many millions of Americans from voting. So it would have this big cost with no benefit. Already, we don't have a problem of non-citizens registering or voting in this country. As I said, the study after study has confirmed, including state audits of their own voter rolls, that the risk of non-citizens voting is infinitesimally small. We know that only American citizens vote, with very, very vanishingly rare exceptions. The flip side of sort of all of the research showing that to be true is that for many, many years, right-wing activists and even officials have spent millions of dollars trying to prove that there was a problem with non-citizen voting in this country. They have come up empty. They have not produced any evidence of a problem. In fact, I believe Mike Johnson, when this bill was introduced previously, said something like, We know that non-citizen voting is a problem. We don't have the numbers, but just intuitively, we know it's a problem. But we do have the numbers,
Right.
actually. And the numbers show that it absolutely is no problem at all. The systems that we have in place to keep our elections secure are working. The prohibitions that say already that only American citizens can vote in state and federal elections are working. And so this is a bill that's a solution in search of a problem. And the thing that Congress should be focused on instead is actually making it easier for Americans to get registered and to stay on the rolls and to be able to access their right to vote. We do have real problems with our election and our democracy in this country, and those problems are fixable by Congress. But this bill is not the solution.
Right. And I know you've said that in a number of ways in this conversation. So thank you for repeating it, because I don't think that people quite understand that voter fraud, despite how often it's mentioned by certain actors, Republicans, conservatives, it is not an issue. I was thinking back to the 2008 election when Obama was first elected. We weren't talking about voter fraud because it wasn't a thing. We've never talked in my lifetime, going through presidential election cycle after election cycle. Voter fraud has never been an issue until following that election, in 2013. I think that's around the time I started to hear it. And people started talking more and more about voter fraud that wasn't a thing. And now, if you look at some surveys, a good percentage of Americans actually think that it's an issue and that laws like this might be good. I don't think they really understand the full impact of it, but they think that there are enough people voting without the proper ID that it could turn an election. And that's just not true. It's never been true. And I think people should really just kind of absorb that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most impactful data points to support what you just described is that before the 2024 general elections, we heard a lot of chatter from right-wing activists about concerns about fraud, the risks of ineligible voters participating. We've, so much so that that those claims were being used in 2020 as an effort, or after the 2020 election, as part of an effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election. So we heard an enormous and at high volume claims about voter fraud and risks about voter fraud. After the 2024 general election, when those folks got the political outcome that they wanted, we've heard very little chatter about
Very
that.
little.
And so I think that really belies what's going on here, which is that there are certain actors who, for partisan benefit, want to make it harder for Americans to vote. And they will use whatever narrative they have at hand to try to achieve that outcome. And when that narrative doesn't particularly serve them, we don't hear much about it. But again, we know from the research, there have been an enormous amount of studies on this, that the risk of voter fraud is extraordinarily rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than for someone to commit in-person voter fraud. This is not a problem that Congress needs to set its sights on solving. We do still have improvements to voter access that could be made and could enable more Americans to vindicate their right to vote. We do still continue to see race discrimination in voting that needs rectifying. We do still need to fix the problems that the Supreme Court created in its Shelby County decision, which you mentioned, in its Brnovich decision that also undermined the Voting Rights Act. There is quite a lot that Congress could do here, and the SAVE Act is not something that is going to help strengthen our elections in any way.
Right. There are loads of things that Congress could do that would be much better than this, that would actually help Americans. And might I just point out that this is some clever rhetorical trickery here. The SAVE Act, in fact, does not save anything. And, it's really interesting because, it's being couched as this thing that's, to kind of chivalrous, you save Americans, when in fact it's actually disenfranchising Americans. That's something that we see pretty often.
Absolutely. I think the reality is that we have to save each other from the SAVE Act and really make sure Americans' voices are heard, and that folks should be in touch with their members of Congress, with their senators, and ask them to vote no on the SAVE Act if and when it comes for a vote, because it is our responsibility to protect our access to democracy and our right to vote. And so instead of relying on the SAVE Act, we really have to save one another from the very dangerous policies that it would bring.
And you said it could come to the floor as early as next week, right?
Yes. Absolutely. It has been, it is one of the bills that the Republican House has fast tracked. And so it could come for a floor vote by the whole of the House as early as next week. They don't particularly give me a lot of early insight into when they're going to set things for a vote. So it's possible that that could slip into later into March, but very well could come to the floor next week.
Right. I hope people are making noise with our congresspeople about this and their representatives. They should emphasize the fact that this is costing taxpayer money. There's no plan to cover the cost of this.
I'll add just another thing that folks can raise with our members of Congress, because sometimes the other side will say something like, well, this policy is only going to affect people who don't participate anyway. And we know that that is not true. We know that this will have an impact on active voters. So, according to research done by the Brennan Center, of the people who lack ready access to their citizenship documents, 64% of them are registered to vote. And most of them, 60%, reported that they are sure that they voted in the 2020 election. So the people who would be disenfranchised by this bill, they are active voters. They are already participating in our democracy, and they would be impacted if and when they have to re-register to vote. And again, more than 12% of Americans move every year. So the impact with respect to re-registration is quite significant. And we also know that the effects of the bill are roughly equal for both political parties.
Mhm.
8% of Democrats said that they cast a ballot in 2020 don't have easy access to passport or birth certificate, compared with 7% of Republicans. So this is not a policy that's only going to hit one party or the other. It's not only going to hit a small community or a certain type of American. It will hit everyone, regardless of party, regardless of race, regardless of state, regardless of community, and is important that Americans really reach out to their representatives and say so.
Right. As people call their congresspeople, they should not only mention the fact that this is going to cost taxpayer dollars, but it's pretty quite shocking that election officials will be held criminally accountable, which is pretty bad.
It's astonishing. I mean, these are election officials who work tirelessly to pull off a pretty complex, extraordinarily important role in our society. And they do that not just once every 4 years, not just once every 2 years, but there are state and local elections that are going on pretty much all the time. They're really heroes in our democracy, and they have taken a battering in recent years. These are folks who had to figure out how to hold elections during a pandemic. These are folks who have been targeted by lawsuits, by threats, by harassment. It is astonishing that this bill would impose civil and criminal liabilities for honest mistakes on the very people who are making our democracy work.
Well, Eliza, thank you so much for joining me. This is a really important conversation. I really hope people call their congresspeople, and I really hope that we can save ourselves from the SAVE Act.
I want to just say that I think we can. This is a winnable fight. I know that in the present moment in politics can feel a little depressing, and that sometimes we as citizens can feel a little powerless. This is a fight that's worth having, and it's a fight that's winnable, and that folks can really take concrete action to try to stop the SAVE Act from becoming law. And we can win this if enough people weigh in. So it's worth taking the time to write, to call, to get engaged on this one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks.